And I'm Isaac Fetterman. I was born in 1922 in Volbram, Poland, a small little city of 12,000 population. Half of it was Jewish. I had a family that was the puttiest, physically the puttiest family in town. I had my mother. She was gorgeous and beautiful. My two sisters, they were in their early 20s, and I had a little brother. My father died when I was 9 months old, and I don't remember my father at all. Although my mother was left with 3 little orphans, she maintained her living by manufacturing men's shirts. And she worked very hard, and she was so good that she wouldn't get remarried, she told us, because she didn't want a stepfather to be involved until we grew up. Eventually she remarried, and I don't remember exactly, but I must have been about 10, 11 years old. In 1936, I left home, and I went to Benjin, which is a town about 60 kilometers from Volbram. I attended school for a year, and then I went to Lodz. Until 1939, I worked in Lodz, and I went to school. And my mother insisted that I come home because there's going to be a war. And this was sometimes either July or August. And I came home, and of course, a few weeks later, the Nazis invaded Poland, September 1, 1939. We were very close to the German border where I lived, so it didn't take too long for the German army to occupy Volbram, my little town. They came in on Monday morning. Hundreds of tanks came through our city, and they occupied our town. And about Wednesday, the Gestapo moved in and set up shop. And of course, they announced that all males 14 years and up must report at the square. Nobody knew for what reason, and of course, anybody that wouldn't would be shot. So happened that my sister was able, my younger sister, she was older than I was, except she was one of the younger one of the two, spoke to the German, and he let me go somehow because she told him that I wasn't 14 years old, of course I was 17. The Gestapo took all these people and they marched them to a little town of Zawiercie, which was 40, 50 kilometers from our city. For no reason in the world did they do anything except just torture him for several days in the heat without food and let him go. And they all came back home. A month or two went by. As I mentioned before, my mother and my father, my stepfather now, had a little manufacturing plant of men's shirts. And of course, my father had a long beard. And in those days, whoever had a beard wasn't because it was stylish. They had a beard because they were recognized as religious Jews. So of course, if he went outside, the German soldiers used to take these guys and tear the beard out, so he couldn't operate this business. So at that time, I had to get involved and somehow to make a living. So I took a bicycle, and I used to go around in the little small farm country places and peddle some of the shirts that my mother and my father used to manufacture. And from there, I went with my bike back to Benjin and Sosnowiec, where I knew some people. And this way, I was moving merchandise from one place to the other in order to make a living. And one day, on the way back, I came through a little town by the name of Slavkov, and there was a bridge going over a small little river, and the German soldiers were guarding that bridge. So they asked me to stop. I came through on the bicycle, and of course I knew that if I stopped, that there will be trouble, so I didn't. And I just ran as fast as I could. And they shot after me, and of course I got a flat, so I had to return back. And they beat me up and turned me over to the Polish police. They had Polish policemen in the area, and they took me back to the city. And the Polish police took me into their place, interrogating me to find out who I was and so forth. And I was lucky then that they did turn me over to them, because otherwise I probably would have been shot. I found out later that anybody that was caught on the bridge was immediately shot and thrown into the river. And I was lucky enough that I survived this particular situation, except when I came out of the police station over there, I found that my bicycle was gone. So here I was completely out of business. And I walked 40, 50 kilometers back to my city. I stayed overnight in one of the Jewish homes in the square, slept overnight, and the next morning I walked home. And I came home without my bicycle, because I was home several months, and late in '39, my mother sent me to get something from the grocery store, get some sugar and buy some butter. And 6 SS men stopped me, and they kicked me, and they told me to get on a truck. And I was arrested, and I never came back home. From there, they took me on a truck to Miechów, a little town which was 21 kilometers. And henceforth, I spent the next couple years in 5 different labor camps. These were really not camps. They were like, we worked for a private construction company, a German private construction company that built roads, bridges, railroads, barracks, and stuff like that. And what they did is they used, slave labor, supposedly, for that purpose, that they didn't have to pay. That's all they did, is get the army to guard us and feed us and work 12 hours a day. And we were told, the main thing that we were told is that anyone that tries to escape will be shot. And then they will go back at the family and shoot or take him into concentration camp. The first real concentration camp that I came into was Rzeszów. Rzeszów was it was east of Krakow, and a little bit south. We worked in an airplane assembly plant that was really a precise kind of work. And if you didn't do your job, that was all over with. I stayed in that particular camp over a year. That's the longest that I spent in one concentration camp. The winters were absolutely horrible. The food was terrible, and the beatings were just horrendous. I stayed in there over a year. In fact, that's the first place that we realized that they're killing people. Anyone that got out of the line was taken behind the barracks and shot. In fact, I remember a person that was there with his son, and he must have been, I'd say, 45 years old, and his son was probably my age. And the winter was so bad that he went outside to relieve himself. And evidently, a guard noticed that from the tower. And they put the light on him, and they sent another guard with a dog, and they caught this guy, and they put him into separation away from the barracks. And the next day, his punishment was to dig a hole for the latrines outside. You know, and a latrine was probably as big as a half a football field. And no person could get it done by himself. So, of course, all of us from the barracks used to jump out and try to help him. But eventually they shot him right behind the barrack. After the Rzeszów, we were taken into back east into several areas behind after the Germans invaded Russia in 1941. They kept going east, and as we stayed in Rzeszów, they took some of us out of there and took us on these trips out to the Russian side to do some work for the German army. And eventually we were retreating with the Germans into Ploszów. And that must have been around 1943. I stayed in Ploszów 3 months or so, I don't remember exactly. But when I came in, I ran into a young kid. I was at that time 21, and there was a young kid that was probably about 15, 16, and he was from my hometown. And he told me to make sure that I do not go between barracks by myself. Because usually when you come into a new camp, the most important thing to do is to kind of find out where everything is so you can kind of know what to do and how to protect yourself. And this kid really told me not to walk between barracks because Mr. Gether, who was the camp commandant of Ploszów, was shooting down, as you saw in Schindler's List, and anyone that he could point at that was walking by himself, that he could kill him. That's what he did. And I made sure that I didn't go by myself, usually between barracks while I was in Ploszów. From Ploszów, we were taken to Wieliczka. This was an area that had salt mines, and we were taking over there to work in the mines for several months. Again, it was very cold. This was already the winter of 1943, or the fall of 1943, if I can remember correctly. And we spent several months in those coal mines, the salt mines, just bitter cold. I couldn't wait to get out of there to find something else, possibly get away from there. We were lucky enough to get out of there, and they loaded us in boxcars and took us west into Germany. That was the first time I came across the German border as a inmate. And they took us into near Brunswick. There was, in German it's called Braunschweig. In English it's Brunswick. There was a camp, and the name of it was Klinker. Another horrible camp. The food, again, was very sparse. And at night, I would go into barracks that were occupied by German civilian guys who came out of jails. They were jail inmates, certain convicts that were made in charge of that particular camp that is inside the camp. They were running the operation inside. And I used to go in where there was a dining room where they were feeding those people. And usually they had better food than we did. So I tried to help at night and clean the place up. And I used to take the potato peels and put them in a sack and take them back to my barrack. And in the morning, there was pretty good food. With the watery soup that we got, that went pretty well. It helped. Several weeks went by, and there was one of these convicts. His name was Otto. I don't remember his second name. And he says, "Come over here." And he was a guy probably in his 30s or 40s. And I was a young kid, and he said, "Why are you taking all those potato peels? I've been watching you." And I was afraid to tell him, but I did. I said, "Because I haven't got enough food, and I eat that." So he told me that he'll help me, and he did. He let me come in and clean his place and gave me some food every once in a while. And he also announced to me that no Jewish person gets out of this camp. Now, if you want to get out, I'll try to help you, but you must leave, because never will a Jewish person get out. And when they have transports get out of there, they're usually non-Jews that they move out. And of course, he helped me to get out of there. And he was a good guy. From there, we were taking to Flossenburg. Flossenburg was a camp near Dachau. We stayed in Flossenburg several months, and it was in the Bavarian mountains. During the day it was hot, and at night it was freezing. And what they did, the first thing they did, they took our clothes away. And they kept us naked for 3 days, 3 or 4 days, supposedly that they were sent to disinfect. And then several days later, we got a pile back, and it was anybody's guess what you're going to get. You got whatever you could to get some clothes on, and then we used to take in exchange. I was a little guy, and I'd have a big suit, and the big guy would have a little suit, and we just change courses, and we survived somehow. This was another camp. There was absolutely no work, and it was strictly to torture people and to kill them off. So several months, and I got out of there. And I took a chance and went, kind of volunteered again, and wound up in Bergen-Belsen. Bergen-Belsen was a bad choice. I spent a couple months in Bergen-Belsen, and from there we were transferred to Sachsenhausen. Sachsenhausen was near Berlin. And there I ran into, again, my luck, that I ran into a fellow from my hometown. He still lives in New York City. And he was a watchmaker at home. I remembered him. He was a little older. And what the Germans did in Sachsenhausen, they used to bring in all the stuff that they took away from all the different camps, watches and all kind of stuff. And they had a manufacturing plant to repair all this stuff and to put it in shape. And Wellner is the guy that worked in there. And I found out, and they were separated with a barbed wire around their particular situation over there. And I found out, so I made my way over there at night. And Jocelyn Wellner used to take care of me and give me a little package because they fed them better than us. The worst thing we had in Sachsenhausen was the appels, what they called, in the morning. They'd wake you up at 5 o'clock in the morning and sometimes earlier. And you'd stand in roll call for hours in the mud up to your knees. And then after they decide that everything is in order, we'd get a little soup and coffee, not too hot. And then they'd load us on trucks and they'd take us to Berlin. And after all the bombings, we'd clean the streets up. The Americans were bombing in the daytime and the British would bomb at night. And we used to go in, and that's the work we did in Sachsenhausen. I did that several months. And then I was lucky to go on another transport. And this time, I caught a pretty good one. It went to France, Colmar. The Americans are coming closer. So the Germans packed us up in trains and took us again back to Germany. From Colmar, they took us into Hamburg. From Hamburg, I was sent back again. They moved us back to Bergen-Belsen. This is my second time to Bergen-Belsen. And of course, Bergen-Belsen wasn't any better than the first time. It was awful. People were dying. People were being murdered on this and going to work. One day, I tried to volunteer again, and we were specifically told that no Jews should volunteer because you're not accepted. But I did anyway. And evidently a German recognized somehow that I'm Jewish. And he asked me to pull my pants down. And in Europe, Jews were only people that were circumcised. So he recognized and he told me to report that night. But I knew that if I report, that's going to be over with. I had a very wonderful Russian friend at that time. He was to start out with a POW from the Russian army. And we made it out of the camp that evening. But we weren't gone too long. I was shot a couple times, and eventually we were recaptured. And we were taken into Hamburg. And I was dumped. This particular time I was lucky that there was a big alarm, and they were bombing the city. And our German guards had to run into a bunker, and they dumped us into a jail. And I got mixed up with all the inmates over there, and that saved my life again. And a few days later, we were all gathered up and put on a train, and we were evacuated again. We were on the train for 11 days without any food. By the time we got to Sandposten, which was my next camp, I'd say that probably 60% or more of the people were dead by the time we got there. And this was pretty close to the end of the war. This must have been probably March or April of 1945. And that's all we were doing there, is gathering the people in the morning and putting them on pile, the guys who died overnight. Typhus was all over the place. One day, they brought in a transport of the last of the Hungarian Jews. And I went with another guy to take a barrel of soup for the newcomers. And of course, by that time, I think most of us were like animals. And this guy and I took that barrel of soup into the latrine. And we literally ate that 100-gallon of soup by ourselves, like, the two of us. And of course, after that, I was sick. Full of typhus, diarrhea, high fever. And I found myself, the only thing I remember, that I was under a water pump, trying to stay alive. Two buddies of mine dragged me over there to that water pump, and they kept pumping the water on me. And the only thing I remember is that I saw a British tank come across the wall. And the next thing, I woke up 3 days later, 2 or 3 days, I don't remember. And I was cleaned up, and I was hooked up, being fed intravenously. And a British captain was standing over there, and he said in Yiddish, "What is your name?" I weighed 80 pounds. And this doctor was Dr. Bloomfield. Later years, we went to visit him in Manchester, England. Ann and I went to visit him. He told me that I had 2 hours to live, and that they really saved my life. I was in a field hospital, in a British field hospital. And I spent 6, 7 weeks, I don't remember, a couple months, and they put me back together somehow. I survived. A lot of us didn't. So one day, a soldier came in, a British soldier, and he says, "You're going to be discharged. You're getting out of here." And he says, "Where do you want to go?" And I said, "I don't know where to go." And he says, "Why don't we look at a map, and we'll see where you'd feel comfortable to leave." And here I'm in a pair of pajamas. That's all I got. By that time, I'm 23 years old. I have nothing. So he takes me in the Jeep in my pajamas, and we go to the little town of Soltau. And we go into a house. And the lady answers the door, and he says, "Is your husband home?" And she says, "No, he's in prison. He's on the Russian front." And she says, and he said, "Have you got a picture? We want to see him." He takes a look at the picture. He says, "He's too big. We got to go." We finally went into another house, and he got me dressed up in a pair of pants. This was August of 1945. And a pair of shoes and a shirt. And we decided to go back to Bergen-Belsen. Bergen-Belsen was now a displaced persons camp. And it's maybe 70 kilometers from there, which isn't so far. I said, "Okay, we'll go there." He drives me into the camp, and of course now this displaced person camp are the buildings that the administration was occupying during the war. Now the displaced persons live in these nice buildings, little rooms where the Germans used to live. And he drops me off at the office, and it's in the afternoon, and I go in the office over there, and they tell me that the JDC is operating in the area, and that they have a list, and they're compiling lists. This is only 2 months after the war. and they compiling lists of survivors. And whatever they had, I couldn't find anything of anybody that was my family. And that's really when I found out that my whole family was destroyed in 1942, that everybody was gone. And prior to the liberation, on my second trip to Bergen-Belsen, I'm going back a little bit before the liberation, I ran into a guy that was a friend of my friend who I was with in quite a bit in those days. And he was from Anne's hometown. And he had a friend who was Anne's brother. And then a few weeks later, that's how Anne and I have met in Bergen-Belsen. This is my story up to now.
This is Isaac Fetterman and his wife Anne. We understand that you met in Bergen-Belsen. Can you tell us about that? When, first of all, what year was it?
That was in August of 1945. And as I start to say, this was the best thing that came out of Bergen-Belsen. But I told her right away that we're going to America. We got to get out of here. So a few months down the road, we've decided to get across to the American zone. Bergen-Belsen was in the British zone, as I told you before. The British took me there. And we decided again to travel and get to the American zone. And when the American consulate opened up in Frankfurt in April or March or April of 1946, we were there to register to go to America.
You were married by then?
No. We married in Kansas City.
No. We made a promise to ourselves not to get married in Germany. So we waited because we knew we were going to immigrate to the United States. So we waited and got married 3 months after we came to Kansas City.
Can you describe that trip?
Yes. They picked us up with buses, no trains, and took us to Bremen and gave us $50 a person. And they gave us a ticket to get on the ship. And when we came to the United States, we were 11 days on board. And when we came to the United States, they picked us up in New York. The Hyas took us over. And they took us in New York in a hotel. And they told us we ought to go. They picked 10 of us. And they said we ought to go to Kansas City. And we said, where's Kansas City? They said, well, that's a nice town. So we did. We had nothing to lose. That's fine.
The people have awaited us at the Union Station. We traveled, from New York by train. And the family services here in Kansas City had a social worker. Not a social worker, excuse me, a volunteer. Who came and picked us up and took us to our respective places, wherever we're going to live. The boys were in one place and we were in another place, the girls. And she took us to a room and board place. Most people rented rooms in those days, so just room and board. And we waited about 3 months till Isaac met this rabbi, and I'll let you talk about that.
Later on, I got acquainted with Rabbi Stern, and he was writing a book at that time. So I kind of looked up things for him. I had nothing else to do sometimes in the evening, and they were just 2 blocks away. So I kid Anne a lot about that. I never proposed to her, because one night he said to me, hey, how long are you going to mess around with this girl? It's time you get married. I said, call her up and tell her. He did.
And we made a date for September the 22nd then.
So we did. We got married in the
But I
the
have to
city
ask-
was at the wedding.
Well, they had this big article in the Jewish Chronicle that Friday before wedding Sunday, and they were talking about 2 concentration camp people who are going to get married. So, yes.
Yep.
But the wedding took place, and no invitations, just announcement in the paper. We had to have 500 people at that wedding. Those days, the community really showed up. And we had
They
a
were
lovely
wonderful.
reception wedding. We went to Denver on our honeymoon on a Greyhound bus.
We went to night school. We learned how to read and write, speak a little bit. And then we went to citizenship class.
And then after 5 years, I was pregnant with my son when I got my citizenship papers 5 years
We were
later.
very happy to become American citizens.
It was the most wonderful feeling to be in that courthouse holding up a flag to become citizens of this United States. And we're just very lucky to be here.